Welcome to the Unit Economics Podcast. I'm Josh Stabinsky. On today's episode, I sit down with Noah Phillips, founder of Honey Department, a recently launched brand selling creamed honey in a tube. Honey Department started with a pretty simple observation. Everyone uses honey, but almost no one thinks about the product or the brand, and it's still mostly sold the same way it always has been. But what looked like a pretty straightforward idea to start quickly turned into a much more complex product and supply chain for Noah to develop. We walk through the decision to use creamed honey so the product would actually work in a tube, how Noah built a supply chain that runs from a co-op in Mexico to an apiary in Texas to a separate co-manufacturer, and what it took to go from zero to a finished product in a category with very little standardization. Lastly, we also spend a lot of time on branding and positioning as it's a huge part of the story. I learned so much during my conversation with Noah, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I did. Noah, thank you for being here today. I really appreciate the time. If you wouldn't mind just starting with a brief background on yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks for having me. Well, I'm Canadian, originally born in Toronto, grew up there and then came to the States for school and never left. Studied advertising design at Syracuse University. And then I moved to San Francisco and LA, worked at agencies, came to New York, continued to work at ad agencies, and then went to freelance. And for the past decade plus, I've been a freelance creative director working for agencies, brands on every possible brand and product and industry, and started a design studio, Foreign National, which I've been doing on the side, making furniture, domestic objects, and doing some brand identity projects as well. And then among all that, I was looking for something of my own that I could continue to work on, and honey just came about. And so for the past 18 months, 2 years, I've been working on that.
Talk to me a little bit about how you landed on honey specifically.
It's a few things that sort of came together. Obviously, the need to have my own thing. I think I was getting tired of giving away all the creative ideas for other brands and not really being able to control the brand and the outcome. My dad is a hobbyist beekeeper. He's been doing that for a while. And so I grew up in a very honey-loving household and know way too much about honey and bees. And he has his own hives. And I come back every year and check on the hives and help him do the harvest. And a few years ago, he came to me asking me to help him with labels for his honey. I thought he was just going to let me go for it. But he had something in mind and got those honeycomb-shaped glass jars and had an idea of like a label. And I just started to look at it from a design problem, which was why had honey not sort of matured and modernized, and it was sort of stuck in the past. And I felt like beekeepers were great at beekeeping, not necessarily great at branding. And I thought somebody could do something interesting in this space. And at the same time thinking about, well, what else is wrong with honey? And everybody seems to love honey, but the form factor is uninviting, it's sticky, it's messy. And I just thought maybe there is a different form factor for it. So I just kept thinking about these two things, about the sort of white space for a modern honey brand, and then also why honey was stuck in either glass jars or the plastic bear. And so it just kept nagging on me. And eventually it just sort of struck me the tube might be actually the best solution. And the branding part was something that I was excited to dig in on and push against the sort of traditions of traditional honey, both on the grocery store shelf and at farmers markets.
Yeah, it's so funny to me that no one had ever thought to put honey in a tube before, because it seems like the most obvious form factor for the product to sit in. I'm interested to hear a little bit more too about if there was anything in your eyes or in your mind that wasn't meeting your expectations in terms of the actual product. What did you see in that regard?
I started to just ask around anybody, like friends, family, do you like honey? Everybody says yes. Do you eat honey? Yes. Do you have honey? Yes. What type of honey do you have? Not a single person ever answered the name of the brand of the honey that they had. They would tell me, oh, I just bought, whatever at the grocery store, or I found this really great local honey at the farmer's market, but could never name the brand. And I just thought, well, that's interesting coming from like a branding, advertising like background, that nobody could name a, honey brand. They would say, oh, the bear, but lots of brands own the bear. It's been around since the 50s. It was never trademarked. Lots of brands like use it. And so I started to look at the honey industry at large, and there's either, big commercial honey, and a lot of it is mixed, and it's actually not even all real honey. They cut it a lot with like corn syrup, and you don't really know where it's coming from, and it's a mix of things, and it's liquid honey. It's very light in color. They put it in a plastic bottle. They sell it for cheap. Or there are the local producers, and I love local producers and beekeepers, and I think that that's wonderful that that's still going. But there was this real big space in the middle of consumers just not really knowing which honey to buy. And honey is the oldest food in the world and the most versatile. It can be savory or sweet. It could be used for cooking or baking, hot or cold. But people were just stuck with honey being used. You put it in tea when you get sick, or you might squeeze it onto your yogurt and granola bowl in the morning. And I just thought it can go on absolutely everything. And why are we sort of stuck in these sort of traditions of honey expectations from both brand side and the way that it was used? And so I thought maybe there's a big opportunity here to not educate people. They all know what honey is, and I think that they know how it could be used. I think they just sort of needed a reminder, they needed a bit of a push, and they needed a brand that made it a little bit more accessible and more creative and more convenient, just more usable. I think the idea of just reaching for a jar and a spoon isn't that big of an effort, but it still blocks people from easily accessing and grabbing honey and just putting it on whatever they're eating.
Yeah, I think there's also something to if you can introduce a more delightful experience to somebody's day, they're just going to be more likely to re-engage with that habit. And so the sort of behavioral aspect is really interesting to me too, which I think we'll get into later. But I'm interested to hear more about the early days. So you're assessing what exists in the market and you think, okay, there's something here. Walk me through what it looked like to simultaneously work on formulation because you're using multiple varietals and this is a blend, it's thick honey. You were deliberate in the actual product that you went to market with, and you had to figure out the form factor as well. So, talk to me a little bit about what it looked like to work on both of those simultaneously.
I originally thought it was liquid honey, the traditional honey that everybody eats. And I thought, we kind of take that out of a plastic bottle or the glass jar. Maybe there's another way. Originally, I was thinking maybe it's one of those pumps that you would, like you have soap or whatever. Maybe that's something, but then it would clog it up. And I got to the tube, and it seemed just so obvious. I felt like I knew everything that was on the market, and I was still going to grocery stores and sort of looking, is anybody doing anything kind of interesting? And I never saw anything beyond the jar or the bottle. One time I saw a plastic pouch from a Hawaiian producer, and that was the most interesting that I saw like in the space. But I came to the tube thinking that might be the best solution. And while it could technically work with liquid honey, I love creamed honey, which a lot of people might have eaten or might have seen, but aren't really like familiar with it. And creamed honey is still single ingredient. It's just honey. And you are intentionally crystallizing the honey. So what happens with your liquid honey when you leave it on the shelf for too long? It gets that sort of crusty, it gets clogged or whatever. So if you take those crystals and you actually intentionally mix them into honey, you create microcrystals, and you keep creating them really, really small until the honey over a couple days of stirring turns into this thicker, more sort of like luscious, buttery, creamy, sort of stable product. And once it's set, it stays there. So it won't crystallize, it won't get crusty like over time like other honey will. So when thinking about, okay, I have the form factor here and I could put liquid honey into it, I thought maybe we adapt creamed honey for something that's thicker that I think is a better experience. I think it'll work better coming out of the tube as well. And it might introduce people one more step into the honey world. And I can always come back and then embrace liquid honey, which I would love to do. And I have the ambitions of like doing. But I thought everybody's eating honey. They're familiar with it. They know liquid honey. But I just thought maybe I can take creamed honey. It would work better for the tube and it would introduce more people, maybe bring them into the honey world with a familiar but not version of it. And then that gives me permission to then open it up to a number of honey products.
Talk to me a bit about how you were sourcing early on or where you looked initially. How difficult was it to find your source? I'd love to get into the actual supply chain as well because it seems fairly complex. My understanding is that you're sourcing the honey from Mexico, but then it winds up in Texas. And so I'm really interested to hear more about how this process actually works.
Finding a honey producer was a bit of a task just because there are so many independent honey producers, but they're creating for themselves. They're, making for their own sort of like brand or family and farmers market, or there's big commercial producers and they are importing from China and Brazil and huge batches and mixing it all together, putting it in a plastic, and then that's how it ends up at like the grocery store. So finding producers, preferably in the States, who had great quality honey and were willing to wholesale it was actually more difficult than initially expected. After speaking to a number of them, I found this great family owned apiary in Texas. Really, really like them. I like their product. They produce for themselves and then they also do some wholesale, but mostly like in Texas. And they enthusiastically said yes. They liked the challenge of it. They were interested. They really love like producing honey for others. While they do make great honey, as we started to experiment and formulate, thinking how hard you could take any liquid honey, you can turn it into creamed honey, there's actually a number of factors in that. And so this apiary sometimes sources from other places depending on their product needs. And so he found this really great farmers co-op in the highlands of central Mexico. And they had the type of honey that would work best for our purposes, which was thickening it and creaming it. Honey has different flavors. The bees pollinate different flowers and it will take on all different types of flavors. And it changes seasonally, it changes geographically, even if the same bees in the same place with the same flowers and plants, they're going to produce different honey. Each honey also has different sort of moisture point. And so in trying to find something that had a lower moisture point that we knew would be stable for longer, the Texan honey was just not going to work for us. So that was part of the reason that we got from Mexico. It makes the supply chain a little bit more complicated. So far, not as complicated as I would think, adding like one more sort of step and vendor in the process. But we source the honey from Mexico. They are just bee farmers. They just collect the honey. And then the apiary in Texas, they're the one who has figured out the best way to thicken it to what we think is the ideal texture for just the tube and also for eating. So they thicken it up, and then we have a co-manufacturer that it goes off to fill in the tubes, and then it arrives on people's doorsteps.
How long would you say that process took? You mentioned working on this idea for, let's say, 18 to 24 months from initial concept to launch. What took the bulk of that time?
Uh, Man, all of it. The initial search, that was difficult because it was both finding great tasting honey and they would also be willing to wholesale. And I had an idea of some of the other honey producers out there. Some were producing for themselves and then others were sourcing. So it narrowed down into a very few amount of honey producers that we could go to, which makes it easy actually, because then you figure out what your actual options are. That took a little while, and also finding a co-manufacturer because tubed foods are not an American thing. They're more familiar in grocery stores and kitchens in Europe, but they're not really an American thing. So nobody that I could find would fill tubes in the States with food or had a factory that was doing so. And so getting creative, actually started to look at cosmetics manufacturers because, they have the standards of the cosmetics industry and the factories also reach food grade. And so it seemed easy enough at first that, oh, if they can fill it with lotion, they can fill it with food. It makes things a little bit more difficult because there's also temperature and sort of heating, and we need to make sure it's not overheated. And they've never dealt with like food before. And obviously, honey is very sort of sticky. And so finding those two of like a honey wholesaler and a co-manufacturer that could work with tubes, while it seems very sort of simple at first, was actually a bit more of a task in finding the right partners. And then you hope that you like them and they're enthusiastic and want to go on this journey with you as well. And so I've lucked out with my partners. I really love so far, the entire supply chain, and looking forward to growing with them. But that was probably the bulk of the development.
So you're ready to go to market. How do you land on your initial price point? The spectrum of pricing in the honey market is very wide. I think you've landed at about 250 an ounce, if that's correct. And so that's expensive compared to your average crappy honey. But
Yeah.
there's Manuka honey on the market that's insanely expensive. And so I'm curious maybe why some honey commands such an extreme price and how you thought about fitting into the market in that way.
Yeah, I'm not sure if this works for every industry and every product, but I've learned in this experience that you're taking somewhat of a risk until you actually kind of have to produce and then get it, and then you actually figure out what the total economics of it are. So you're hoping that it works and that you have the margins and it's there. In figuring out pricing, you make a good point. Like, the honey prices are all over the place. At first, I was a little bit concerned that people are standing in the grocery store comparing two different products and figuring out the price per ounce. The benefits of the honey industry is that you have commercial honey that's incredibly cheap, and then you have Manuka honey that can be incredibly expensive, and then you have local producers and sort of farmers markets, and they're slightly sort of premium as well. Some of them are incredibly premium. So the prices were all over the place. So I wasn't really going into an industry that had sort of a standard of pricing that I was trying to beat. In considering the pricing, I wanted to do something that was slightly premium, not too premium, still somewhat accessible. I knew that the costs now are going to be the most expensive they will ever be, and it's easier to go down in price than it's going to go up in price. I wanted, the psychology of the consumer having a number that also felt like they didn't have to be too concerned about before purchasing. And I landed at around, $15. And that price is changing, or maybe changing a little bit. I'm trying not to raise the price too much. And if anything, I'm definitely trying to reduce the price, and knowing that eventually moving into grocery retail, it will have to come down. But I haven't had any pushback on the price yet. People, I feel like, are getting value for it. I know what goes into it. I'm not trying to, gouge or increase. I wish I had, higher margins. I feel like everybody always does. But in getting to the price, it was working a little bit with standards of sort of margins in the industry and what I could do to begin, but knowing that the prices would be at their highest, and eventually there are opportunities with both sort of scaling up, being able to sort of, buy everything in bulk, maybe even streamlining or collapsing my supply chain a little bit as well. So I know where it can go. And I just felt like if this is where it needs to start and I'm not really finding any sort of friction or pushback, then the pricing is so far working.
Let's talk a bit about brand. So, for those that are not familiar with Honey Department as a brand, it is a departure from everything that exists on shelf in the best possible way. I would describe it as sort of it's almost like a corporate sort of tone. And I'm really interested to hear about how you landed on this vision.
Well, I'll start with a little fun, factor blooper, but originally I did have this idea of doing low dose THC in honey. So you could put it in your tea or have it at night. It might help you sort of sleep. It was more of a wind down thing. I thought this was a great idea. And I had a brilliant name for it, Funny Honey, spelled the same way as Winnie the Pooh, Hunny. And I thought, this is going to be it. And I actually just started to explore this, not as a product for market, but just as a portfolio piece, because I was more interested in taking a brand from nothing to something and building out everything from the name, the brand, the packaging, the advertising. Then I started to explore it and realized that maybe getting into the weed industry was not the smartest idea. And if you take it out, you actually have a much larger market with less legal restrictions. It's incredibly easy actually to get food to market if anybody like wants to. FDA regulations are far less than the weed industry. Somebody had also trademarked Funny Honey about a year prior to this strike of lightning. So all of those, I started to realize that maybe I was just fearful of like the opportunity of actually creating a product and actually doing something that was more sort of mass market. So I went back to the drawing board, and I've done naming projects for clients before. It's always tougher when you're doing it for yourself. Coming up with a name, I wanted to do something that felt like the standard, the brand standard, the category standard. When I approach most design, I want to do something that has this sort of inherent nostalgia to it. It doesn't really feel too trendy or sort of contemporary. You can't really place it in time. I love products and objects and furniture, these things that you kind of grow up with and you take for granted. And when you grow older, you go back to your parents' home or you start to sort of use them or you buy these things and you put them in your home and you have now this connection to it of, oh, it was that thing that I grew up on. And now as an adult, I'm sort of being reintroduced and reintegrating it into my life. So I was trying to come up with a name that just didn't feel like 2025, 2026. It felt like something that could have existed a long time ago, could have been around decades ago, but also still has relevance now. And so I'm trying to come up with something that felt familiar, both personally, but also familiar in like the category, as if like you read it and immediately you understand that, oh, this is the new sort of standard of the category. I arrived at Honey Department. I had a few different names, but Honey Department just sort of stuck out. And with all fingers and toes crossed, I went to a lawyer and tried to get the trademark, and it was available. And so starting there, that was kind of the jump off point. And it made sense to everything that's come after it, of this kind of what I call like corporate irreverence, this tongue firmly planted in cheek, the idea of a self aware brand. It's not trying to be an individual, and speak that way like many brands are now doing, sort of like, socially led brands. And it's not a very stodgy old honey company. It's almost as if it was, and the kid took over the business and has now sort of reinvented it.
I'm interested to hear about what your moat looks like or what you think your moat is. What's to stop another player in the market from introducing honey in a tube as well? Is it the brand itself that creates the moat? How are you thinking about the defensibility of the brand and the product?
Yeah. Well, definitely the brand. I do think that, I'm not contrarian by nature, but I think that the industry at large, both commercial and local producers, made it pretty clear to me which sort of areas and sort of visual and language to avoid. I think that they're all been doing the same thing. So I'm trying to do something that is zagging, but also not trying to do so in a very sort of brash, contrarian way. I am fortunate that I have a background in, design and advertising and have worked on like, many brands. So I can see where the brand can go. And I think that brand value is definitely something. And similar to like Raza, you can steal the bottle, but you can't necessarily steal the brand. And then figuring out production on this, thinking it was going to be so easy at first, there was a lot of tinkering and dialing it in and figuring out the right sort of varietals and supply and heating and how to do it and when to do it and the timing. And there are a lot of factors that went into creating the product, which was a pain in the ass at first, but then got me very excited because I thought, all right, it's making it more difficult for others to try to replicate this. So I welcome them. I'd be flattered if they did, but I do really believe that the brand and the process and the product and where it can go will be the best moat that we have available.
It is some of the best branding I've seen in a while, and I'm not just saying that. And it seems like you've received a lot of positive press. So you just launched, and I'm interested to hear about your launch strategy in general. But immediately, I saw, for example, in Dieline, a feature, and you were in Best of March 2026, which is huge. That's great feedback right away. So I'm curious to hear both about how you land that sort of press. Was that organic or were you seeking that out? And also what that's then done for demand. Because I think having these larger press moments around launch is a particularly interesting strategy if that's what you were aiming for.
I mean, aiming, hoping for it, but most of it just came organically. Like I knew I loved it and I knew that it was going to be well received. I just didn't think that it was going to be this well received, or I was worried that people might push back, that it was, sort of like novelty or it was hiding behind branding, even though I know that the product stands up to it and I've thought this through. So it's not just, honey in a nicer outfit. So yeah, all the press has been, exciting and overwhelming, and it all happened organically. The design nerd in me was so happy that Dieline like reached out, and sometimes I do have to remind myself, like with the brand, that not everybody who is looking at it or purchasing it is a designer or an art director or even sort of familiar with that space. And audience and customer are not always necessarily the same thing, but I wanted the legitimacy from the branding and the design world because I felt like that just supported what the average viewer and customer, how they were responding to it as well. I wanted to make sure that the branding was sort of tight, but not like rigid, that it immediately sort of like represented both like the product and the brand, and you could see where it was going. It felt inviting. And so all the press has just been very much appreciated and has driven some sales. And we sold out of our initial batch. And I'm hoping and expecting some more positive press and attention to come. And it's been really nice for people to reach out and to hear how everybody has been like responding to it.
Yeah. So selling out immediately is fantastic. That sounds like excellent news. But I'm wondering if there are any hidden downsides there, perhaps wishing you had more inventory on hand for launch. How did you think about inventory forecasting for such a novel concept for your first run?
I was just visiting family back in Toronto and was so apologetic that I just didn't have enough honey to go around. I was telling them like I don't have enough that I can be excessively like using it. I'm being, only have a few tubes left. Inventory forecasting, I know this affects everybody, especially at the start. You don't necessarily want to over order and sit on too much inventory. Fortunately, I do have a shelf stable product. So that wouldn't have been the biggest issue to have. It's just more how much money and conviction do you have out the gate? I did an initial run. This is after some light, sort of not even full production runs with the co manufacturer. We were still figuring things out. And when we finally hit it and did a run, it was based off of the amount of honey that I felt I was comfortable purchasing and filling, and that would get me into launch. Do I wish I had more? Of course. And it's now changing my expectations and my ordering on this next production run. It's hard at first because you don't have any previous data to go off of. So I just thought I was doing the smart thing and probably was. But the downside of that is now I am scrambling for tubes and running into some production delays as you start to work with your suppliers and your manufacturers, just getting everybody into the rhythm of production. So this next run, I wouldn't say I'm over ordering, but I'm definitely being very ambitious with how many that I'm going to have because I don't want people to wait. I'd love to give my family and friends some more. And I also want to have a bunch at hand as I begin to push into retail.
So the demand is already there, and I imagine it will continue to just pick up as supply becomes more readily available. But I'm wondering what would happen if over the course of time you just see a massive spike in demand. What breaks down in the system first? For instance, from the farm that you're sourcing from today, from this co-op, what percent of their honey are you taking? If demand 10x, do you need to find another supplier? I guess, like, where does this break down first?
There is a breaking point with, all supply. It's not going to come soon. I know that I can scale up, and I am barely taking any of the honey from like what they're supplying. These bees are working their asses off, and they are supplying quite a bit of honey. So I know that I can scale for a while with my current supply. I've also seen what other honey brands have done and know what the plan B is, where the next step is of increasing supply. I've already gone outside of the States, and that's totally fine. And I think most people don't know where their honey comes from, or that it's like blends, and the majority of it is all imported like anyway. So there are many opportunities in the States and beyond where I could find similar quality varietals of honey to be able to scale up. It has not been an issue or consideration, them running out of honey supply as I scale. So
Yeah. So quite a bit of runway.
yeah, and when it does happen, and I hope it does, I thank you for helping manifest it. I would love for that to be like my next problem. I already know what the potential solutions are, so I'm not sort of stuck with limiting supply endlessly.
And I assume the same is true on the tube front as well, that they're just producing a massive amount of tubes and there's no issue there.
The tube is not a problem. I mean, like they are, from China. There are some other producers in Europe as well, but all of the cosmetics industry goes to the same source. There are a number of aluminum and plastic tube manufacturers. So that hasn't been an issue. In fact, it was an issue to begin with because the MOQs were so small. Just trying to find one of them who would only, do 10,000 to start was much lower than, traditionally what they demand, which is 40, 50,000 tubes at a time, which seems like a lot. And then as you start to go, really like not that much.
Were there any regulatory hurdles along the way? It's interesting to me that you were working with a supplier working in the cosmetics space, and, you mentioned it's actually shockingly easy to go to market with food, but I do know there is some consideration around what sort of vessels food can be sold in. I'm assuming you considered that from the start, but was that an issue, or did you just immediately find somebody where their tubes were okay for distributing food?
Yeah, I wasn't limited by too many manufacturers that made tubes that were then not food safe. And I made sure that whichever supplier I had the correct documentation that it was food safe. And beyond that, I didn't want anything that where the material would be reactive with the honey, would potentially like change the flavor. It's not very acidic, but there's enough in there that with metal, that was potentially like an issue. But I made sure that wherever I was sourcing the tubes from were official, were documented. It was food safe. The honey could go into it without any risks and without affecting the flavor of the honey at all.
I'm interested to hear about if you've been able to gather any early consumer feedback, any early consumer data around how people are consuming the honey. Is the form factor leading to a change in behavior in the way that you were sort of hoping it would? How do you go about assessing that with what I imagine is a fairly limited amount of data at this point?
Yeah. And I wish I had more. It's always the first question that I ask after they've received the honey. I'm always asking, like, well, how are you using it? The feedback so far, when they do start to use it, really illustrates the convenience of it. They're using it more frequently. They're using it in ways that they might not have before. It's becoming something that sits on the counter and not sort of, forgotten about in the pantry. which is wonderful because I was hoping that that behavior might change. I thought maybe it would take a little bit longer, or worried that they might use it, a few times and then it would get forgotten. But people are going through their tubes. Also, how they're using it, more actually put in their coffee than I was expecting. They're using it as a alternative sweetener, which is like great. Using in their tea, but people are putting it on food, and they're putting it on types of food that I haven't even tried. And I was trying not to be too prescriptive out the gate with how it should be used. I thought it doesn't really need instructions on the back. And I like this idea of being creative and finding opportunities and using it however you want to use it, meeting people where they're at, not trying to overwhelm them with recipes and suggestions and making it seem difficult. And I figure as I scale that, the more people are using it and hopefully posting about it, others will see how it's being used, and not necessarily coming from the brand, but actually coming from the people who are buying and using it every day.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm interested to hear a bit about how you're thinking about entering retail. So, my understanding is that you are interested in selective retail introduction, given that you're just D2C right now. How do you balance all of the trade offs around just sticking with D2C to start versus entering retail? And I'm interested in the word selective. How are you thinking about where you want to show up on shelf?
Launching D2C seemed like the obvious move, and I knew it was visual and the photography, and I was hoping that people would take that leap and try a product that they've never tried before. And they have. Like, people have been buying, 3 tubes at a time, more so than the single tubes, and going through it, hopefully giving one to a friend. But I don't think it's been that risky of, "Oh, I'm gonna try this thing, and I hope that I like it." DTC for launch for myself was just sort of like more than enough to manage. I designed and built the entire website myself, and I've been packing up orders and responding to customers and managing like all of that. So that seemed like an overwhelming amount just to begin at launch. And I wanted to make sure that I had the proof and the traction before I began speaking to retail. In approaching retail, it's a very crowded space. It's always been a crowded space, but now more than ever, it's more accessible for people to be starting their new brands. And even if you have a great product and it stands out, I am a little bit concerned with where it sits on shelves among others. You look at it from a few feet back and it all just sort of blends together, and it's hard to really like stand out, not against the competition, but just the entire category of CPG. And while I'm speaking to a lot of retailers and I will be on the shelf with, many of these brands, I'm looking at the strategy of I have a very design forward product, a different form factor, shelf stable, and consumers and retail have been sort of expanding and collapsing at the same time. You don't necessarily only find food or beauty in their respective stores. And so my strategy, like right now, is being selective. I'm in New York and familiar with a lot of the retail in New York, but I am trying to find less sort of obvious, less grocery locations where I can begin. And I think that there's more space there. There's less competition of sort of like CPG. It's also a strategy that just positions the product slightly differently than a grocery item, treating it more of design object, accessory, not in a way, that's sort of obnoxious and too sort of like fashion forward. But I think that you open up beyond grocery like many other brands are unable to do. And I'm just getting excited about where are the places where you might not expect it, but you wouldn't be surprised if you saw it there.
Yeah, I was going to ask if you're comfortable sharing if there are any surprising types of retailers you're looking to get into. Are you comfortable sharing any examples of the types of storefronts you're talking about?
Yeah, I'm speaking to some sort of expected, more like boutique grocery, and being selective about those to begin. So, yeah, I'm not saying no to those opportunities, and of course, that's where people are buying their groceries and finding new brands, and so I want to be there. But in some of the other places, I think that there's You find coffee shops in fashion stores now, and you find home and design objects with other sort of, food items that's been around for like a while. And so I'm really interested, and New York's got plenty of them, and I'm really interested in exploring those to begin, not necessarily chasing, sales and velocity like out the gate, but really thinking like longer term brand positioning and who are the types of people that shop in these stores. I feel like these are influential, tasteful, smart people. And yes, I could target them on socials. And I, have been giving out honey to a number of people, press and influencers and sort of like friends and friends of friends. But I think that putting in these places with these types of shoppers, if they're the ones who are first to the honey department market and they start to use it, then going from them to their friends and then like beyond, I can always scale into mass market. It's always harder to sort of reposition yourself and go into these sort of narrower places.
Makes sense. Something interesting I noticed on your website and doing research for this conversation is that there's a note that says you're thinking about new forms and flavors. And I find that to be particularly interesting because when I think about other brands, like when I think about a brand like Graza, for example, they just stuck with olive oil in that form factor and they did it really well. And they did it for a little while before they started to venture off into other categories. And so I'm wondering how you're thinking about SKU expansion, flavor expansion, knowing that it's really easy to go too quickly too soon. How are you weighing that?
Yeah, this is one of the risks of having a creative at the helm is I'm constantly writing down new ideas of where honey could go. I mean, it is so versatile, and I think that there are many ways that can be explored that have already been invented, but just maybe not familiar. And there are many other areas and forms of honey and form factors that it can be put in. So I have an idea of where I would like to go for, the next product and the one after that. But I also understand that that might change along the way depending on, how this one goes, or maybe the second one doesn't work out the way that I want it to. But I love thinking about where else this can go, how else I can, adapt and present and package honey into creative, unexpected, yet sort of familiar ways. So I'm not there yet. I'm trying to focus on what I have in front of me, but I'm very excited for the potential of new products and form factors to introduce that as this scales up.
I guess at what point will you know it's time to introduce something new? What has to be true in order for you to say, okay, it's time to introduce this new form factor, for example?
First, I'd love to just get more people, buying the honey and using it and having it, on their counters and their desks and in their bags and getting familiar with the brand and the product and bringing it into their routine. And also in terms of, sales and availability, I just would like it to be more accessible to more people and have them use it and get that into a more sort of like comfortable place before you start to introduce another one. I'm looking at the very like long term and I look at, there's brands like Graza and how long it took them before they introduced a potato chip, which was, still brand collaboration. And now they're doing like mayo. I look at lots of brands and I think, wow, it took you that long before you introduced a new one. But I just now in it, I understand the sort of speed of business and CPG and I want to make sure that at least for the next year that I'm focusing on just thick honey in a tube. I've only been selling the large tube this size, but I have a number of the minis, the travel size. And those have been free if you're buying a 3-pack, and I've been using them for promotion and tasting and giveaways and bonus. But there's already a demand for the small ones. People want them because they're easier to travel with and they go places where other honeys never have. They're TSA approved as well. And so I'm now working on packaging to make it a little bit more like retail friendly and also easier to ship. And I think I'm going to introduce the smaller size, the travel size tubes to the market ahead of schedule.
Yeah, it makes sense. I think Graza is a great parallel just in talking about brands that took an existing product but sort of reintroduced it to the market using a much more delightful form factor. So in their case, this sort of squirt bottle, this squeeze bottle. Another brand that I think of when I think about this sort of theme is One Trick Pony. I'm a huge fan of Lucy's and their peanut butter and their packaging, and I've shouted her out on the show several times now. But I think that's another good example of, reintroducing the market to an existing product that everybody's familiar with in a way that makes it so much more delightful to use the product. And I'm curious if there's any other examples of brands doing similar things that you look to for inspiration.
Yeah, well, big fans of Lucy. I love One Trick Pony, and we've now been connected and already sort of scheming because I think that our products do make a lot of sense together from both a design standpoint, but also peanut butter and honey.
I will have to drop an emergency pod if you two do a collaboration together. That is very, very exciting to hear.
Right. No, we're talking about how we can collaborate, but I just love what she's building. And when I saw that form factor originally, I just another sort of like, obvious and it stands out on the shelf. And I like the entire brand and design and the packaging as well. Graza's another, it's come up a number of times. I wouldn't say that they were like an inspiration, but I really love what they've like built. And I look at what they did similar to what Honey Department is doing, which is simplify and amplify. If you can simplify the purchase decision and the use of it, and then you can amplify how it can be used, I think they did that with olive oil. People go to the aisle, they don't know what they're buying, they're overwhelmed by it. If you can just make that decision simpler, and then if you can show people that, you know what, olive oil has been traditionally used this way, but it can actually be used in all these ways. And so I am in parallel to that sort of like playbook with how do I make the purchase decision easier with honey? And then how do I help people enjoy it in more ways than they had thought of before?
What's something you've changed your mind about since you first came up with the idea for Honey Department?
I'm a measure twice, cut once person, and maybe this industry was not the best decision for that. I'm constantly trying to think of what could go wrong and get ahead of the problem, but quickly realizing that the majority of the problems that you face in this industry can really only be addressed when they happen. And so you can expect them, but I can't necessarily prepare for all of them. I'm trying not to do too much sort of like hindsight of what I could have done differently, but I'm always trying to best prepare for the unlikelihood of something going wrong. What is my solution like for it? Which is smart thinking, but in practice, it's just not how it goes. So I think there's a lot of, adjustments as you go. And so I'm just getting more comfortable with problem solving on the fly and being more sort of like decisive and trusting intuition because it's easy to get distracted by what others are building and how they're building it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we have time for one more question. Where do you see Honey Department 3 to 5 years from now?
Oh, I mean, I'd like to see it 10 to 20 years from now.
Even better. Let's go 3 years from now and then 20 years from now.
Yeah, well, 3 to 5 years from now, I would love to see it. And I mean, this is probably the answer that most would give is I'd love to see it in everybody's kitchens, not just kitchens. I would like to see it, yeah, in cars and on desks and in kitchens and beyond. I would love, honey not to be an occasion. I'd like it to be a routine. I'd love people to be showing up to parties with, for cheese and charcuterie boards with like a honey in hand. I'd love to go over to somebody's house and just see one on the counter that you don't need to ask permission for. You don't need to ask for a spoon. You can just sort of open it up and just sort of use it freely. And so that's probably my 3 year answer is just making it more accessible to like more people. 20 years out, I mean, I would definitely like to be a threat to big honey. I don't think, I'm not actually even looking at the industry at large as sort of like the competition. And I think that they've been sort of, sleeping on a bigger opportunity here and just focusing on cutting costs and giving what is technically honey, but isn't really. I mean, yeah, more products. I'd like to just sort of expand how we think about honey. And I think there's so many categories that it can go in. There's more than I even knew when I began. I knew that the culinary world would embrace it, which they have, home cooks and professional, like, chefs, cafes. I'm trying to get into some, cafes, both drinks and pastries and, coffee and lattes, but also fitness is like a huge opportunity. MMA fighters have been reaching out to me, and, casual sort of like fitness enthusiasts of, being able to put this in your gym bag or using it for sort of, energy on runs or at the gym or putting it in your smoothies. I just found out that it induces labor. So maybe the maternity category, but it's a great problem to have of too big of an audience or too many places to go. And I'm trying to figure out which ones to speak to first. But I just see so many different categories and opportunities, which gets me excited about what forms of honey can be adapted to serve that audience best.
Noah, thank you so much for the time. I learned a ton. If you want to share with listeners where they can find Honey Department, please feel free to do so.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I love talking honey, so I appreciate it. Right now, they can find it at honeydepartment.org. And very soon, we're talking in the next month or two, at select retailers in New York and then beyond.
Amazing. I'm so excited to follow along.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
All right, let's debrief. A few things stood out to me in today's conversation. First, product decisions tend to cascade. In this case, getting the consistency right so the honey would actually work in a tube ended up shaping almost everything else downstream. What Noah could source, how it's processed, how it gets manufactured, and so on. Second, a lot of complexity doesn't show up until you're actually in it, trying to build something. On paper, this was a simple idea, but in practice, Noah had to deal with cross-border sourcing, processing, and finding a manufacturer that could actually handle development of the product. And lastly, clarity on brand tends to compound. The way Noah articulates what he's building is extremely specific, and I think that level of intentionality tends to make everything else easier down the line, from product decisions to how the brand shows up in the real world. I really enjoyed my conversation with Noah, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. If you haven't already, make sure to follow or subscribe wherever you get your podcasts so you can stay up to date with the latest episodes. Thanks for listening.